Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Scotland at 7 with me, Gordon Ross. This evening, most of the news, actually, the first part of the show is to do, sadly, with the prorogation of Parliament by Boris Johnson. And with John Major's lawyer now wading into the whole sorry tale of the prorogation at the High Court, Downing Street has allegedly put out misleading statements about the prorogation of Parliament and published excuses for Boris Johnson's 5-week suspension of the Commons, which are not true reasons. The Supreme Court has just been told by a lawyer for the former Prime Minister, John Major. The extraordinary clash of evidence between the former Conservative Prime Minister and the current one surfaced on the third day of an emergency Supreme Court hearing before 11 justices about whether Johnson's 5-week prorogation of Parliament was in fact lawful. Lord Garnier QC, Conservative former Solicitor General, intervened in the case on behalf of John Major, whose strongly worded attack on the trustworthiness of Johnson's newly appointed administration. In Downing Street, Garnier had said it had been misleading in releasing announcements during the summer which initially suggested reports of an extended prorogation were entirely false, and its effect was plainly there to mislead, he added. As to the Cabinet minutes suggesting prorogation was necessary to prepare for a Queen's speech and a break for the conference season, Garnier said that they were not the true reasons. The attack on the veracity of the government statements by Major came as lawyers for the Prime Minister submitted defiant legal advice, threatening to suspend Parliament again if the Supreme Court called Johnson's prorogation unlawful. In a written submission, lawyers for the Prime Minister said that in the event that the court holds that the prorogation was unlawful, with the effect that Parliament was not prorogued and remains in session, then depending on the court's reasoning, it would still either be open or not open to the Prime Minister to consider further prorogation. So it appears that Boris Johnson's lawyers are basically saying that no matter what the court seems to suggest at the end of this process, that there is no real reason for Boris Johnson to actually go along with it. They're actually saying that he may well choose to continue to prorogue Parliament or to prorogue it yet again. The government statement also states that if the advice is found to be unlawful, the Prime Minister cannot commit to take any more particular steps without knowing the terms of any declaration and the reason for it. So these are very much technical excuses for why the Prime Minister is not going to take any action if this is found to be unlawful. The government has declined to release its legal note, the further submissions on relief, which asserts that it retains the power to resuspend Parliament. The document was tweeted out by Jolyon Mon, QC, of the Good Law Project, after it had already been referred to in court. Ministers are entitled to reconsider the decisions that are deemed by a court to have been unlawful. It's highly unusual, however, for the government to declare in advance of a judgment that it intends to make the same decisions again. So in submissions to the High Court earlier this month, Garnier obliquely compared Johnson to an estate agent, citing the 2009 New Zealand case of premium real estates involving a salesman who misrepresented a buyer as a genuine purchaser, when in fact they wanted to resell the property for a quick profit. It can hardly be suggested that the duties of the Prime Minister to the monarch are less than those of an estate agent to a homeowner, Garnier noted. And so accordingly, if the court is satisfied that the Prime Minister's decision was materially influenced by something other than the stated justification, that decision must be unlawful. So the Council is basically saying here that if Boris Johnson's reasons for suspending Parliament were not what he has stated to the court, then by that standard, then he has acted unlawfully. The Supreme Court was also told that the government's failure to consider its internal discussions on the 5-week prorogation to what happens in Northern Ireland was gross and unthinkable. They're actually now also complaining that the Supreme Court has actually heard that the government failed to consider Northern Ireland in its 5-week prorogation period. In other words, they had no no consideration for what might happen in Northern Ireland over a 5-week period that the Houses of Parliament have been shut down. Johnson's do-or-die battleground language of heading for a no-deal Brexit, Ronan Lavery QC said, was being played out on what would become a scorched earth policy in Northern Ireland, implying here that Boris Johnson is happy basically to sacrifice Northern Ireland to gain a successful Brexit outcome, come what may, whether it's no deal or whether there is a deal. Lord Wilson, one of the justices, said that he was really worried that viewers listening would gain the mistaken belief that the court was considering the virtues of Brexit. In a sharp judicial put-down, Wilson told him, "Don't abuse our politeness or Lady Hale's," the president of the court, patience. He was supported by Lord Reid, who told the court whether or not the withdrawal from the EU is a good or bad thing is not the issue before us. Another justice questioned the relevance of evidence from the government's Yellowhammer report, which set out the impact of a no-deal Brexit. Mr Lavery told the court that MacCord speaks for the silent majority in Northern Ireland who want a peaceful and prosperous future. Now, this man, Lavery, is referring to the Northern Irish case brought by Mr MacCord, who is the survivor of a victim of the Troubles, who is bringing a case against the UK government for the damage caused to the peace process by Brexit. In written submissions to the court, Lavery explained the only reason that Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom is by consent of its people, freely given in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement referendum. Therefore, if the rule of law is to be undermined by a prorogation with the illegitimate or unlawful and unconstitutional aim of facilitating a no-deal Brexit, then the constitutional position of Northern Ireland itself in the United Kingdom is undermined by this prorogation. So here we are also hearing from a Northern Irish lawyer acting for Mr MacCord that the prorogation also threatens to undermine the peace process in Northern Ireland. Withdrawal from the EU in terms that are harmful and oppressive to the people of Northern Ireland, firstly, undermines the principle of consent of the people of Northern Ireland by preferring the interests of English nationalism over the safety and welfare of of the people of Northern Ireland. And secondly, it's a breach of the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, which states that it would be wrong for there to be any constitutional change in Northern Ireland without the consent of the people. The Scottish Government's Lord Advocate, James Wolfe QC, also argued that no substantive justification has been provided for the 5-week prorogation, which was unusually long. Now, moving on from this, Mr Johnson, the Prime Minister, if he loses in court, it does look as if he could suspend Parliament again, according to another document which has been revealed today. A court document has been tweeted by an opposition lawyer on Thursday, and Britain's top judicial body was hearing a third and final day of arguments today on whether the Prime Minister's decision to suspend Parliament from September 10th to October the 14th was lawful. On Tuesday, one of Johnson's lawyers had told the court that if the Prime Minister lost the case, then he would recall Parliament earlier than scheduled. This would give more time for legislators to scrutinise and oppose his plans to lead Britain out of the European Union, with or without a deal, on October 31st. But in the new document, not disclosed to the media, but published by a lawyer, Joe Mon, one of those involved in the legal challenge, Johnson's legal team appeared to say that there would still be a way for him to keep Parliament from sitting, depending on the exact wording of the Supreme Court's judgment. Depending on the court's reasoning, it would still either be open or not open to the PM to consider further prorogation, two senior lawyers representing Johnson had said in a written submission to the court. Again, this is referring to this claim that regardless of the outcome of this court case and court appeal this week, that Boris Johnson could in fact, and may well in fact, prorogue Parliament again. That it's no guarantee that he will actually behave according to the law. Now let's leave this for the moment and look in a little bit more detail at what is happening with Brexit in Europe. And in this release from Reuters today, titled "A Smokescreen or Solutions, Britain Lays Out Its Brexit Ideas." Britain said on Thursday that it had shared documents with Brussels setting out ideas for a Brexit deal, but an EU diplomat described them as a smokescreen that would not prevent a disorderly exit on October the 31st, the divorce date. Now, on the back of this handout, I should be able to give you some more details. He said, if I can see the rest of it, the confidential, non-technical papers were not the formal, written legal proposals that Brussels had asked for. This appears to suggest that these were sketches, basically back of an envelope, ideas or concepts for some kind of way of getting around a trading border in Northern Ireland. But they're not what Brussels has asked for, and the diplomatic tensions are mounting as the deadline approaches for London to leave the political and trading bloc it joined in 1973. France has said that the time to agree the Brexit deal was running out, and that Britain needed to come up with something concrete in the coming days if it hoped to clinch a deal with EU leaders at an October the 17th to 18th summit. Now, this is something which we heard about actually yesterday, where I believe it was the French president and also the president of, I'm not sure if it was Denmark or I think it was Finland, Finland's president or prime minister. Both of these men had suggested that Boris Johnson had to get something concrete on the table within 2 weeks, by the end of September, because otherwise there would not be enough time for the European Union's leaders to discuss and debate whatever was being proposed. However, the Brexit Minister Stephen Barclay has said that London was in no rush to comply with EU requests for a specific written proposal and urged other 27 member states to be flexible and creative to reach such a deal. He said, "Why risk crystallising an undesirable result this November when both sides can work together until 2020? This is Barclay referring to the actual date at which the conclusion of Brexit would take place, this being the end of the period of 20 months leading up to Brexit, if there was a deal. So he's claiming then that they have until December 2020. We risk being trapped in a zero-sum game, and that will lead to zero-sum outcomes. Britain wants a deal to guide its relationship with its biggest trading partner after it leaves the bloc, but it would leave without one if both sides cannot agree to a deal in the next 42 days, he said. The EU has warned on Wednesday that Britain was headed for just such an outcome, as London's ideas for solving the contentious issue of how to treat the Irish border were very far from unlocking a deal. He said Britain should stop pretending to negotiate. In fact, I believe Michel Barnier said exactly the same thing just yesterday. In fact, he said that the European Union did not want to take part in pretending to negotiate with the United Kingdom. Sitting on one island, Ireland is in the EU, but Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, so the border between them will become Britain's frontier with the EU after Brexit. In a worst-case scenario, a no-deal Brexit could mean severe disruption to trade, supplies of medicines, fresh foods and possibly public disorder, according to the British government's contingency plans. The British government has said that the documents that it had shared with Brussels reflected the ideas it had put forward verbally in recent meetings with the EU's Executive Commission. In Brussels, an EU diplomat said the documents were descriptive papers, in quotation marks, rather than legal texts, and described London's gesture as another smokescreen, which would be rejected by the Commission as too short on detail. The Finnish media cited their Prime Minister Antti Rinne as saying that he and the French President Emmanuel Macron had agreed that end of September deadline for Johnson to present a concrete proposal to avoid a no-deal Brexit. The idea, he said, was to say that time was running out and we won't be negotiating directly at European Council summit level in mid-October, the French diplomatic source said. We're a bit worried over what is happening at the moment in Britain and the mess which is created in Europe, the Finnish media cited Prime Minister Antti Rinne as saying. The British government spokesman pushed back against the idea that a deadline was looming. "We will table formal written solutions when we're ready, and not according to an artificial deadline, when the EU is clear that it will engage constructively on them as a replacement for the backstop," he said. Johnson says his aim is to secure a deal and that he'll seek an agreement at the EU summit to remove the Irish backstop as an insurance agreement to prevent the return of border controls between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Opponents of the backstop in the British Parliament worry that it could lock the United Kingdom into the EU's orbit for years. However, in the European Union, frustration appears to be growing. Ireland said on Thursday that Britain had failed to supply a credible Brexit proposal, and there had been no breakthrough in talks on Wednesday with the Northern Irish party that supports Johnson's Conservative government. The Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, this is the Irish Republic's Foreign Minister, incidentally, said that frustration was growing in the EU and that London had not yet tabled credible proposals. In London, Britain's Supreme Court hearing was in its third and final day of legal arguments over whether Johnson had acted unlawfully when he suspended Parliament in the run-up to Brexit. If Mr Johnson loses, he may be compelled to recall Parliament earlier than scheduled, giving additional time for legislators to scrutinise and oppose his Brexit plans. A ruling could come late on Thursday at the earliest, but is more likely to be delivered in the following days. Most members of the House of Commons, Britain's lower chamber of Parliament, are opposed to a no-deal Brexit. The hearing in the Supreme Court stems from Johnson's decision to ask the Queen to prorogue or suspend Parliament from September the 10th until October the 14th on the grounds that he needed time to prepare a new legislative agenda. So from the length of this prorogation, this must be one hell of a legislative agenda. Mr Johnson's opponents say the real reason he sought the suspension was to prevent Parliament from interfering in his Brexit strategy, and he has unlawfully misled the sovereign with his advice. Okay, so moving along from this, we're still on the whole subject of Brexit. I know this is going on rather a long time. Okay, the countdown to Brexit. Before the suspension, Mr Johnson suffered one defeat after another in Parliament where he has no majority. And the ruling, if it comes late on Thursday, but as I say, is more likely to happen in the following days, could make a big difference to how Mr Johnson's strategy unravels in the next few days. The inescapable inference to be drawn from the evidence, this is according to Mr Johnson's opponents, is that the prorogation is to prevent Parliament from exercising its right to disagree with government and legislate as it sees fit. Okay, let's leave all of the legalese for the time being and actually look at how no-deal Brexit might affect the United Kingdom. There has been a warning today from the OECD, and in a no-deal Brexit, according to the OECD, will slice almost 3% from Britain's economic growth over the next 3 years, compared to just 0.6% from the rest of the EU, according to the OECD's latest health check on the global economy. Amid concerns that all developed countries will experience slower growth next year, the Paris-based club for the world's 35 richest states has warned that the UK will take the biggest hit if the government fail to secure an agreement with the EU. Their analysis estimates that losing unfettered access to EU markets after the 31st of October will probably plunge the UK into a recession next year. The loss of trade, investment and technical knowledge, plus a further fall in the pound, will prolong Britain's slow rate of growth until at least 2022. Lawrence Boone, the OECD's chief economist, has said that an agreement to smooth Britain's exit was important to protect businesses and the economy. The best thing is to avoid a no-deal Brexit and to stay closely aligned to the EU as possible, she said. Ms Boone said that she was concerned that after 2 years of heightened uncertainty created by the tit-for-tat tariff wars and the Brexit negotiations, the depressed state of the global economy risked becoming permanent. The concern is that with high levels of uncertainty going on for so long, that we run the risk of low levels of trade and investment becoming entrenched, and that would leave countries even more exposed to financial shock. Global investments fell to 1% in the second quarter of the year, and the world trade dropped from an annual rate of expansion of 6% in 2016 to 0.5% in the second quarter. So a very, very big drop in the growth of the global economy. The OECD says it expects the UK's rate of GDP to fall to 0.9% from 1% this year, and down 0.2 percentage points from its May forecast. But she said the UK would experience a contraction with a knock-on effect to employment, investment, and in 2020 without a Brexit deal, although it was difficult to estimate the full extent of the shock without knowing how the Bank of England and the government would react. Across the 19-member Eurozone, growth will drop 0.1% to 1.1%. So the European Union also suffering lower growth rates, but not as bad as here in the UK. Ms. Boone has urged developed countries to open their wallets and to bolster infrastructure spending to stave off slowing growth and to improve tax incentives for firms to expand and create jobs. She has also praised the Dutch government for outlining a package of measures this week worth 1% of GDP, including extra cash for affordable housing and funds to support infrastructure. So these... okay. Coming to our next story now. The fastest growing terrorist threat is from the far right, say the police. And this is from a report in The Guardian today. 7 out of 22 major plots since March 2017 have been driven by far right-wing ideology, according to the police. The Metropolitan Police have said the fastest growing threat of terrorist violence in the UK is from the far right, with 7 of the 22 plots to cause mass casualties since March 2017 are being driven by extreme right-wing ideologies. They said referrals to anti-radicalisation programmes for those feared to be at risk of committing far-right acts had doubled between 2016 and 2018 and were expected to rise further. In a briefing to the media, Britain's top counter-terrorism officer, the Metropolitan Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu, said the police were battling to stop extreme right-wing terrorism from gaining more of a foothold than it already had. He said, "The problem is small, but it's my fastest growing problem." He said the extreme right-wing terrorism had gone from 6% of the caseload 2 years ago to 10% now. Some of these instances were incited by far-right propaganda, such as Thomas Mayer, who murdered the Labour MP Joe Cox in 2016. But others, such as Darren Osborne, who attacked Muslim worshippers with a van in North London, had acted after consuming lawful material from groups such as the English Defence League and the mainstream media. I'm assuming by lawful material he means propaganda material which is deemed to not be illegal and therefore able to be published freely in the UK. Mr. Basu said when nearly a third of the plots foiled by police and security services relate to right-wing ideology, it lays bare why we are taking this threat so seriously. The remainder of the statistics were jihadist, which remains the biggest terrorist threat to the UK and has stabilised at a very high level after years of growth. But far-right terrorism has drawn in some as young as 14 and has links to extremism overseas, the police have said. Last year even, MI5 took the lead in investigating the most dangerous extreme right-wing terrorists in a sign of how seriously the threat is now being taken. Police said the right-wing extremists had been using guides on how to kill, which had been developed by the Islamic State. Quite a horrific idea, the fact that the far right in the UK are now actually taking a page out of the playbook of Islamic State. Mr. Basu said that National Action, the only far-right group banned under prescription powers in the UK, has been decimated, with only small groups or individuals now operating online across international borders. But he warned that organised groups were not his greatest concern. The lone actor threat is the biggest problem, he said. We are bringing the full might of the UK counter-terrorism machine to bear against those extremists of any ideology who wish to do us harm or incite violence. And it's evident not only in the number of plots we have foiled, but also the number of convictions we have achieved and we continue to chase through the courts. But he also said that there was clearly a correlation between the rise of hate crime and far-right activity and the politics during and since the EU referendum in June 2016. But he also added that far-right threat had been present long before that. Okay, let's move along from this story now to our next item. Again, a story quoted from The Guardian today, and this one, a very sad story indeed, actually. This one struck me straight away as probably one of the most poignant stories of the day. An asylum seeker has been denied cancer treatment by the Home Office, and as a result of this, she appears to have died. An Ethiopian woman who is denied potentially life-saving cancer treatment for 6 weeks amid confusion about whether she should be charged by the NHS has died aged just 39. Kelimua Mulat, who had advanced breast cancer, was refused chemotherapy last year after the Home Office and NHS officials decided that she was not eligible for free care. Mulat, a mother of one, was eventually treated by the internationally renowned Christie Hospital in Manchester after its doctors expressed concern and said her need was immediately necessary, which is permitted treatment under the rules. Her lawyer, Jeremy Bloom, said that her death showed a real and sickening human cost to the government's hostile environment strategy, which forces the NHS to impose upfront charges on migrants deemed ineligible for free care. In further developments in this story, Mr. Bloom of the law firm Duncan Lewis said that Mulat had suffered unnecessarily as a result of the flawed policy, which seeks to make hospital staff act as immigration officers, a job for which they were ill-prepared and ill-suited. Mulat is one of hundreds of patients who've been denied treatment for serious health problems under the policy, which is strongly opposed by Britain's doctors. In Mulat's case, consultants at the Christie Hospital believed the chemotherapy was immediately necessary in April last year to treat the metastatic breast cancer which had spread to her abdomen and spine. However, she was refused treatment for 6 weeks due to the way her asylum claim had been processed by the Home Office. She eventually began chemotherapy on the 7th of June after her case was highlighted by The Guardian. After she was initially turned away from the Christie, Mulat was prescribed a stopgap treatment of daily letrozole tablets and a monthly Zoladex injection, and for this she was invoiced £3,500 almost, causing significant distress. So a very sad tale indeed, and as her lawyer has said, highlights the unfairness of the government's hostile environment to asylum seekers and to migrants. In our next story, we are moving to Israel, and news that Benjamin Netanyahu is struggling to hold on to power as his nearest rival, Benny Gantz, has claimed victory. The Blue and White leader has rejected an offer to serve under Likud, which is Mr. Netanyahu's own party, after a close-run Israeli election. So it seems that basically the Knesset in Israel is now a hung parliament, and there's going to be an almighty battle because Netanyahu himself is mired in corruption allegations at the moment, and his opponents are taking advantage of that to try and unseat him, although they will probably have to form a government with his Likud party. Okay, coming back home now to Scotland for some more news, this time involving both the First Minister and the Queen. And this is also from The Guardian, from their Scotland editor. Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, has implied that the Queen should refuse to be drawn into a future vote on Scottish independence after David Cameron admitted that he had asked the monarch to intervene in the referendum in 2014. Mr. Cameron had confirmed in a BBC interview that he had asked the royal household whether the Queen could raise an eyebrow, as he said in his interview earlier today, about independence, after an opinion poll had put support for leaving the UK at 52%, just a few days before the referendum in 2014. The monarch is supposed to be impartial, but on Sunday before the vote, she told a well-wisher outside the Crathy Church in Balmoral, "Well, I hope the people will think very carefully about the future." Now, Patrick Harvey, the co-leader of the Green Party, pro-independence party, had asked Nicola Sturgeon on Thursday whether the UK government could be trusted again not to seek the Queen's help if a second independence referendum takes place. Another referendum is coming, said Mr Harvey. We all know that. But does the First Minister think that we can trust that the head of state won't once again be invited to interfere in the vote of a sovereign people? Miss Sturgeon replied, "Well, that should always be a matter for the Scottish people. We know that support for independence is rising. Demand for another independence referendum is rising too." She added, "Scotland does have a right to choose its own future, and I think the revelations, if I can call them that, from David Cameron today say more about him than anybody else, and really demonstrate the panic that was at the heart of the UK government in the run-up to the independence referendum 5 years ago. Of course, that's nothing compared to the panic that is in the heart of the Unionist parties now about independence. Anti-independence parties have refused to sanction a second vote, while some Unionist politicians have floated a leave or remain option for a referendum. But Ms Sturgeon concluded, they know that they don't have the arguments against independence, and they also know that when Scotland is given the right to choose, that Scotland this time will choose to become independent. Mr Cameron had told the BBC that a YouGov poll putting the yes vote at 52% in 2014 had hit him like a blow to the solar plexus and had led to a mounting sense of panic. He remembered a conversation with Jeremy Haywood, then the Cabinet Secretary, who in turn spoke to Sir Christopher Geidt, the Queen's private secretary at the time. And Cameron said that he was not asking for anything that would be in any way improper or unconstitutional, but just a raising of an eyebrow, even a quarter of an inch, we thought would make a difference. Well, I don't think it really did, but who can really tell at this late stage? Now, coming again back to Scotland, and this time this is news about a flagship policy from the SNP, the Children and Young People Information Sharing Bill. And in this bill, which was enshrined as an act in 2014, this bill is now going to be repealed. Now, this is the supposedly notorious bill, which was named by its opponents as the what was it called now? Hang on, I'll find the right thing. The Named Person Scheme. Now, this was the one which got an awful lot of both Unionist politicians and parents up in arms about the idea of having a person appointed to help families in cases of where children were involved. It was widely misreported and misunderstood, but it now appears that the Scottish Government has decided to repeal this act. Perhaps because it's now been made almost unworkable. The Scottish Government says it will now develop practical guidance and support to give professionals confidence to share the well-being concerns in a compliant way and to help families understand their rights under existing law. This really is mostly down to the sharing of information and the Data Protection Act as it applies to the protection of children. Mr Swinney, John Swinney, said, "I believe we've taken an important step forward in providing families and practitioners with certainty about how information sharing can support the well-being in a transparent way which respects the rights of everybody. The mandatory named person scheme for every child underpinned by law will now not happen. We will withdraw our bill and repeal the relevant legislation. Instead, existing voluntary services that provide a point of contact for support will continue under the current legal powers, where councils and health boards wish to provide them and where parents want to use them. In this way, we will support our children and young people so that they can thrive and rise to the challenges and opportunities that life brings. Only through continued investment in our children's well-being will we achieve our vision of a prosperous country where everyone gets their chance to fulfil their potential and no one is left behind." I think that really just about sums it up for this evening's news. I wanted to finish on a story which is relevant, I think, to Scotland, and given the history of the named person scheme, probably as well now that that is over with now, and something a little more practical put in its place. Anyway, it's it's nearing the end of... Oh, I beg your pardon, I've just realised that... I'm sorry about this, I've missed a story here. There is a story here, it's probably got stuck together with some other pages, I do apologise. Bear with me one moment. Oh yes, here it is here, I beg your pardon. We have a story, yes, it's on the minimum pricing of alcohol. Okay, now the minimum alcohol pricing policy has now been revealed to be saving lives in Scotland, and new research has pointed to a 21% drop in alcohol-related deaths in the city since the SNP introduced the minimum unit pricing in May 2018. I'm assuming the city concerned here may be Glasgow, but it doesn't actually say here exactly what city. I'll come back to that later. The president of the British Association for the Study of Liver, Professor Matthew Cramp, has said that the policy does exactly what it is supposed to do. And he noted that minimum pricing is involving the health of those most at risk of alcohol harm. He went on to challenge the UK government to look carefully at the outcomes in Scotland so that more lives can be saved across the UK. Scotland became the first country in the world to introduce a minimum unit price for alcohol last year. And with alcohol-related hospital admissions now also down by 17% under the SNP government. Again, more rather startling statistics of the effectiveness of this new scheme. According to this data, the minimum pricing of alcohol is already saving people's lives in Scotland, said SNP MSP for Glasgow Kelvin Sandra White. With alcohol-related deaths in Glasgow dropping by over a fifth since the policy was introduced. It's absolutely clear that the SNP government's approach to improving Scotland's public health is now working. And I'm not surprised that a leading public health charity has also endorsed the SNP's approach to tackling alcohol abuse and demanded that our world-leading policy is rolled out across the UK. Last year, Scotland became the first country in the world to introduce minimum unit pricing. But we've also banned irresponsible multi-buy promotions, and we've cracked down on drink driving. We're moving in the right direction, but there are still far too many families affected by the devastating impact that alcohol can have on people's lives. The Scottish Government will keep working hard to tackle alcohol misuse, but it's time Westminster caught up with the SNP's progressive initiatives. This was, incidentally, I was going to say a tax, but this was a proposal which was vehemently opposed by many of the SNP's political opponents in Holyrood, but now seems to have been entirely vindicated. And with the news of this 20% drop in alcohol harms as a result of it, I think it's clear to see that the SNP were right all along with this one. And indeed, the UK would do well to take a leaf out of the SNP's book on this particular occasion. So a good news story, I think, to finish this evening with. Apologies for the glitch earlier on. As you know, we make our programmes here because you support us. Making television programmes is an expensive business. So we're... beg your pardon. Sorry, just give me one moment. I seem to have lost something else in the script here. We have a lot of script tonight, and it's quite easy to get lost in it. Forget it. I'll come back to it another time. As I was going to say to you. Oh, I beg your pardon. I found it now. It's right here, right at the end, the last page. Okay. No, I don't have it actually. It's mixed up with everything else. I do apologise. Anyway, I'm sorry. This is my lack of organisation this evening. Anyway, I will wind up tonight with that last story. As you know, it's expensive making television programmes, even ones including somebody who gets things wrong. So if you can help us, please become a supporter of Broadcasting Scotland. It costs just £5 a month to become a supporter. And with enough of you, we can make and continue to make the programmes that you enjoy. So thank you very much for your your support on that. And from Scotland at 7 tonight, and from all the team here, a very good night to you.